Greetings, YouTube. I'm going to be discussing Dungeons & Dragons and Pathfinder here. These are topics specific to those two games. Ever since first edition, people have loved the entire school of Polymorph. Who didn't like the idea of being able to turn yourself into different humanoids, or monsters, or dragons, giants, apparitions, demons? I mean, those were awesome concepts. And it was something that every spellcaster looked forward to. The ability to turn themselves into different things, and of course the ability to turn their compatriots and their enemies into similar things. These were all options that every spellcaster looked forward to having access to, and with good reason. They were, quite frankly, probably the most versatile and utilitarian and combat rich spells in the game, other than the classics, like Fireball and Lightning Bolt and Cone of Cold. Though Cone of Cold, we discovered, was really poor at specific targets. Having to explain to the chieftain why his son was a popsicle was awkward. There were, however, problems. Because they were so versatile, players would often abuse these spells to no end. And in 3rd edition, they changed them slightly, made them a little more limited. You had to have Polymorph, and you had Baneful Polymorph. So Polymorph was a spell you used on yourself or your compatriots. Baneful Polymorph was a spell that you could use on the enemy. And that changed it a little, but not much. And then Pathfinder came around, and they limited it by putting into classes of spells. Like, there was Animal Shape, Beast Shape, Humanoid, Giant, Dragon, things like that. So you were turning into a class of specific beings, and you got specific selection of things that you could use from that class. It wasn't as open as it was in the earlier editions of the game, and I think those were some useful changes. Some people liked them, some people didn't. Some people liked the idea of being able to turn into everything. I can remember in 1st edition having a character who had an artifact. It was the Sword of Kos, I think, and one of its abilities was it allowing the wielder to use shape change, and I can remember shape changing into a pit fiend or type 5 demon, something like that, and making my DM's life miserable as I abused the heck out of that spell, and took a character that was normally a halfling adventurer and turned him into a combat monster. So I can understand why maybe there were some nerfing involved in that particular spell. But there's a couple of role-playing options one which I've used and one which I am just speculating here, that I think might help control the spell in some ways that don't involve actual mechanical changes. And that is requiring the caster to have actual experience with the being. Now, you could apply this to Druid Wild Shape as well, because the Wild Shape ability can be almost as problematic for GMs as the Polymorph school can. And when I say they have to have experience, I mean they have to have direct experience. So there are two options. They can have a part of the creature, a bone, tooth, scale, horn, permanent part that they can use as a talisman, as a focus. Now, they don't lose this in a spell casting. They must just have it around to use as a connection to that creature. So over time, they'd be collecting a bunch of parts that they put into a spell bag or something along those lines. And of course, there's the option, if they lose it, they lose access to the creature, parts that they had. But the other option, a little less savory, though I think in some ways still interesting, is that they must have consumed part of the creature. They have literally taken in the essence of the creature into their own body. This is, I think, particularly good for the Wild Shape option. Of course, that means once Wild Shape is assumed for the first time, is it 5th level? I think 5th level. The Druid's going to have access to a whole lot of forms that are very bloody common. Deer, fish, birds of some variety. Things that they have been part of the creatures, of that caster's, diet. Unless, of course, they were smart enough to realize that at some point they're going to be able to have these abilities, so they've added a few extra things to their repertoire, bobcats and badgers and lions and bears and things like that. Bear isn't completely out of the realm of the possible. Bears eaten by quite a few people. Like pretty much everything eaten by quite a few people. I mean, if you have a strong stomach, look up a bush meat for an example of that. And this limits what they can change into because the GM has a good deal of control over what they've had access to as adventurers. Of course, it means whenever the GM uses their favorite monster or creature or animal, that the characters will someday have access to that creature. So it does kind of turn the game in some ways into more of a chess match. How many things am I willing to place out there on the board knowing that my players can then use them against me? Move, counter move, that kind of thing. Now, some GMs won't like this. That's fine. This is an idea that I have used. I particularly used it with the idea of the shape change. You have to have a direct experience of the creature. And I like the idea that, at least especially among druids and spellcasters, there would be a market for trading body parts. There is now a market for you to collect body parts. Because say you have to have a minimum size of the object. It's got to be, an ounce or 4 ounces. Whatever you want it to be. So there are these pieces of these creatures which are being sold in the market. And of course, the rarer the creature, the more expensive that bit is. And smart people will realize that even if they aren't casters, they can harvest parts of a creature and sell them to casters and druids. Which I think is also a nice role-playing aspect, and kind of plays into the fact that in the real world, animal body parts have always been on the gray or black market. And I think that's a good way of bringing some realistic world aspects into the game. I like that. Now, another option which I've never used, and it's an idea I'm just kind of floating here for people to listen to, is the idea of using really limited access to forms. So, you get an animal shape. You get a beast. You get an aberration. You get a humanoid form. You get a giant form. You get a dragon type. So when you pick which thing you want to turn into, that's the thing you always turn in. And you could probably change it at some point in your career. Say, whenever you get a new level of spell, you could say, okay, I'm changing my giant form from hill giant to stone giant, because in that intervening period you have encountered stone giants for the first time and now have a better giant form. Or the person has to wait. They only get one slot, but are they going to pick hill giant because hill giants are really cool and fairly common, but not as powerful as stone giants? Or do they want that fire giant option? Or do they want to really hold out somehow and get their hands on a bit of a cloud giant or a storm giant? And do they need, if you're going to use this version, do you need to use the organic element aspect that I've described? Or do you just say, since you're only going to get one form, you can just pick it? You may have to met them, but you don't have to have a part of them. You don't have to have consumed part of them. Which I'll admit is problematic. I don't think a lot of hill giants may care if you have a nibble off of a corpse, but I imagine most storm giants and cloud giants would. They would probably take an askew view of the person that they know has consumed one of their dead. Could be an interesting role-playing aspect right there. So these are some ideas I'm floating out here as role-playing fixes for the polymorph school of spells. I think that it adds a little bit more role-playing aspect to the whole process. It does make them less versatile in some ways. There will be something predictable, like the first animal form you're going to get is probably going to be something that flies, because that's very useful. Let's face it, suddenly be able to fly anytime you want to and you're in that form is a great option. You're going to probably want to pick up a swimming form and a combat form and things like that. So it would, kind of narrow things a little bit, but also the spellcaster becomes known for those forms. That's Black Wolf, or, that's, James the Blue Dragon. The concept that he gets is very thematic, very much aimed at that form, I think can be quite interesting. So, I asked my viewers, have you ever come up with a role-playing or mechanical solution for the polymorph school of spells because they bothered you as a GM or as a player? What have you done to make the spells fit your idea in your campaign?